Chapter 4 Modern War. From this place, and from this day forth, begins a new era in the history of the world. And you can all say that you were present at its birth. Goethe. By 1792, in the third year of the French Revolution, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, two of Europe's leading conservative powers. The odds did not look at all good for the French. Many of the officers from the old army had fled abroad, and what armed forces remained were in as chaotic a state as French politics. True revolutionaries were filling up the ranks, but they lacked experience, training, and discipline, unlike the old-style armies marching toward them. Late that summer, the Prussian army entered northeast France, seizing several strongholds and meeting with little resistance. As the Prussians were heading for Paris, the revolutionaries turned on each other. In their panic, the government and its supporters in the streets started a search for traitors at home. The guillotine, invented to provide humane executions, now came into its own as a tool of oppression. Rather more sensibly, the government also called for volunteers to defend France and its revolution. On September 20th, near the village of Valmy, just west of Verdun, the ill-equipped, poorly organized French came face to face with the enemy. The Prussians were still formidable, but they had already lost some thousands of men to dysentery. Cold rain had fallen through the night, and the fields, as they would be again in the First World War, were sodden and muddy. As day broke, the two sides started an exchange of intensive and sustained artillery fire. The Prussians made a couple of forays against the French lines, which held their ground. As dusk was falling, the Prussians decided to retreat, which they did in good order. They had suffered around 180 casualties out of some 34,000 soldiers, and the French 300 out of 32,000. It was neither a glorious victory nor a defeat. So why did the poet Goethe, who was with the Prussians, apparently say, "From this place and from this day forth begins a new era in the history of the world, and you can all say that you were present at its birth"? Part of the significance of Valmy is that the French, out of necessity, were starting to discover new tactics that alarmed and unsettled their enemies. The French soldiers did not behave like those in other armies. They sang revolutionary songs in the middle of battle, took unnecessary risks, and did not seem to know when they were beaten. At a battle the following year between French revolutionary forces and those of the growing coalition against France, an observer complained about the French style of fighting. 50,000 savage beasts, foaming at the mouth like cannibals, hurled themselves at top speed. Valmy is important for its symbolism. The defeat of the old-style 18th-century professional army by a new citizens, one whose members were motivated not by fear of their officers, but by passionate love for their cause. Nationalism, the identification of people as part of something called the nation, had erupted into history in the course of the 19th century. Two further huge changes would join this first one, and together make war more violent, deadly, and destructive. The Industrial Revolution, which brought enormous changes in the means of production, in science and technology, and in the economic potential of societies, was going to transform first Europe and then much of the rest of the world in the century after the Napoleonic Wars. And then dependent on and influencing the other two were the broader social, political, and intellectual changes from urbanization to new ideas about human nature. Nationalism was fostered by ideas, by the works of intellectuals, novelists, ethnographers, and historians. But it extended its impact downward into society and across Europe, and then the rest of the world. Thanks to mass literacy, cheap books, and rapid communications, the Industrial Revolution brought innovation and mass production, and also stimulated social change. The middle and working classes grew in size and eventually in power. while the old landed elites saw the sources of their wealth and their influence attenuate. The widening of the franchise and the move toward constitutional government brought the masses into a different relationship with the foreign and military policies of their countries. Where once war and peace had been the business of the few, now these were questions for the many. Nationalism provided the passion for war, the Industrial Revolution, the tools and the changes in society, the bodies to fight, as well as support from civilians for the war efforts. Modern war was going to last longer, cost more, and demand much of society. In the First World War, nearly 70 million men were mobilized into the armed forces of both sides, 40% of the male population in France and Germany alone. Think what that meant for their societies. Almost everyone would have known someone who had gone to war and mourned those who did not come back. Daily, life changed in so many ways, big and small, as consumer goods disappeared from the shops and food and fuel ran short. Taxes increased, and factories worked round the clock to provide the tons of food, the millions of boots, the miles of fabric, the mountains of shells, or the lakes of oil. In the Second World War, according to the Stanford historian Walter Scheitel, the main belligerents manufactured 286,000 tanks, 557,000 combat aircraft, 11,000 major naval vessels, and more than 40 million rifles, among many other armaments. A new term, total war, had to be coined for the two huge global wars of the 20th century. In 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia, he led an army of some 600,000 men. In 1870, when the German Confederation went to war against France, its forces were double that size. In 1914, Germany mobilized over 3 million men against its enemies. And in 1944, Stalin threw 6.5 million men against the Axis powers on the Eastern Front. Modern war was industrial war producing armies and navies, and eventually air forces on a mass scale, while ground forces were still using horses and mules for transportation. In the two world wars, it was the train, the steamship, and the internal combustion engine that made their scale and reach possible. And while some weapons, for example bayonets and knives, harked back to an earlier age, the vastly improved guns, or the completely new airplanes, submarines, armored vehicles, and nuclear weapons represented another epoch in war. Just as the introduction of metal weapons, horses, or gunpowder had done in their time, as in the past, technological and tactical advances stimulated a search for their antidote. The range of the standard infantry weapon increased tenfold in the 19th century alone, and it could be fired more often and faster. Field artillery in 1800 was effective up to about 1.5 miles on the battlefield. By the First World War, the range was at least 8 times that. The Germans built a massive cannon which dropped shells on Paris from 68 miles away. So in response, the world's armies developed better fortifications. Battlefields strung with barbed wire and ever more elaborate trenches, wire cutters and shovels became standard infantry equipment. When General Sherman's troops marched through Georgia to force its capitulation in the American Civil War, they threw away their bayonets, but kept their shovels. Uniforms changed such too in the battles of the 18th and early 19th centuries, when the black powder used in the guns created a thick fog over the battlefield. Bright uniforms with bold markings made sense for identifying friend or foe, with smokeless gunpowder adopted by most armies. By the last quarter of the 19th century, the beautiful red or blue or green coats, the shining buttons, and the gold braid made wonderful targets for the much more accurate and longer range. Rifles and breech loading meant that soldiers could load and reload lying down, making them much harder to spot. The British learned the lesson the hard way when they marched their red coats across the dusty South African veldt in the 1899 to 1902 Boer War, known more today as the South African War. Afrikaner farmers, who tended to be excellent shots, lay on the ground in their dusty colored work clothes and picked the British off after the Battle of Colenso in 1899. During the Black Week, when the British Army suffered 3 severe defeats, one of their generals complained, "I never saw a Boer all day till the battle was over." And it was our men who were the victims. The British authorities finally put their troops into khaki in 1914. The French infantry marched off to the front in their dramatic red trousers. "La painte à l'en rouge, c'est la France," cried a war minister and much of the military, while the casualty lists lengthened and lengthened again. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, technology gave the defense an edge, as improved firepower extended the size of the killing zone through which attacking soldiers had to move. Imagine, as happened in the First World War, climbing out of the trenches, loaded with a heavy pack, trying to charge through often glutinous mud across churned-up terrain, crisscrossed with shell craters and tangles of barbed wire, knowing all the while that the unseen enemy could pick you off from 1,000 yards or more away. The American Civil War of 1861 to 65, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 78, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 05, the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 all gave warnings of the direction war was turning by demonstrating that soldiers in well-defended positions could hold off much larger forces, which would suffer dreadful losses. Near the start of the Franco-Prussian War, 48,000 Germans held a line 22 miles long against 131,000 French attackers. In 1877, during the Russo-Turkish War, at the Battle of Plevna, the Russians outnumbered the Turks by 3-1, but were unable to overwhelm their enemy. The Russians finally won when the Turks ran out of supplies, an indication of how important logistics were becoming. If more proof were needed, the First World War provided it at the cost of millions of lives. Yet in one of those turns that have marked warfare, the power of the defense was already ebbing by the end of the First World War, as the opposing sides came up with new and innovative ways to break through poison gas flamethrowers, field mortars, tanks, and aircraft. By the Second World War, the advantage had swung back toward the offense. The German Blitzkrieg, with dive bombers and fighters supporting ground troops who were equipped with tanks, armored vehicles, and the humble motorcycle, swept through, around, or over defensive positions. Other armies were quick to learn the lessons, even as the new weapons and methods brought their own countermeasures, such as anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns, or land and sea mines. War moved as well into new dimensions in the air above and into the seas beneath the surface. What was different from the past was the speed of the changes. War also expanded in scope because the energies of societies had to be harnessed to the war effort. Where once the military and civilian leaders had assumed that the supplies on hand at the start of hostilities would be adequate until the war's conclusion, the modern wars, like so many Molochs, demanded constant feeding of bodies, but also of resources. In 1914, in the first phase of the fighting in the First World War, the armies on both sides found to their surprise and dismay that they were running through critical supplies that were meant to last until the hostilities had reached a conclusion. The French used up half their ammunition stockpile in less than a month. Germany's artillery had fired all the shells it had at the start of the war within 6 weeks. If belligerent nations could not harness their economies to the war effort, they could not fight on. As a result, the line between legitimate and illegitimate targets in war blurred until it was nearly erased altogether. Bombing or shelling, Such things as railway lines, fuel depots, munitions factories, and dams were, after all, ways of undermining the enemy's capacity to fight in the field. And gradually, so too, were attempts to destroy civilian morale by flattening their homes, churches, hospitals, and schools, and by killing the civilians themselves indiscriminately. The world got better at it in the 20th century, but it was already happening in the 19th. In the Franco-Prussian War, German forces deliberately shelled civilian areas in Paris to force France's surrender. As the Prussian crown prince wrote in his diary, "All that is in question is to punish that section of the population whose wickedness was the guilty cause of the war." Another new term was to enter the language. By the time of the First World War, the home front, whether or not they chose civilians, were now part of the battlefield. One of the great tragedies of modern war was that the very strengths of societies in organization, industry, science, or resources could turn them into such effective killing machines. Nations could sustain much longer battles for months or years rather than days, and kill much larger numbers of the enemy. It is notoriously difficult to get accurate figures of casualties, dead, wounded, missing, or taken captive. And as authors such as Steven Pinker warn, we should always consider the numbers in proportion to the overall population. So, for example, if the Mongols had done their work in the 20th century instead of the 13th, instead of 40 million dead, there would have been 278 million. Yet, however, we try to understand the human cost of war. The casualty figures and their sharp increases in the period from the Napoleonic Wars. At the beginning of the 19th century to 1945, the end of the Second World War are chilling at the single biggest battle of the Napoleonic Wars at Leipzig in 1813, well before the great advances in weaponry. Of the 500,000 soldiers on both sides who fought, some 150,000 were casualties. Leipzig was fought over 4 days in 1916. The Battle of the Somme lasted for 4.5 months, and there were over 1 million casualties. The 1904-05 Russo-Japanese War gave warning of what was to come when between 130,000 and 170,000 combatants from both sides died. In the First World War, the final death toll for those who fought is around 9 million. And in the Second World War, the figure is at least double that. Civilian casualties were going up even more thanks to the greater capacity of belligerents to reach each other's homelands with their weapons of destruction. In the Second World War, as many as 50 million civilians may have died as a result of mass murder, bombing, or famine and disease caused by the war. A single atomic bomb at Hiroshima killed between 60,000 and 80,000 people instantly, and many more thousands died afterward as a result of radioactive poisoning. It is no wonder that someone has invented the term hemoclasm, the flood of blood, to describe the past century. Yet the race between technology and its countermeasures in the same period also produced responses such as better civil defense and better medical care. In wars before the 19th century, soldiers died on the battlefields, but far more died of disease and their wounds. Now the wounded military survived, often to fight again. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Vicomte de Chateaubriand lamented the new gigantic, all-encompassing shape of war. The old style of civilized warfare, he said, leaves peoples in place while a small number of soldiers do their duty. The new type of war brought the mass mobilization of peoples by the emerging forces of nationalism. Although the French Revolution is often credited with introducing the idea that nations were organic bodies which had existed throughout time and which could demand the loyalty of their members, the roots can be found in the work of philosophers such as Rousseau, with his talk of the social contract and the rights of people to associate freely with each other. and in political events such as the American Revolution of 1775. Every citizen should be a soldier by duty, wrote Rousseau, none by profession. The American Declaration of Independence declared that men were endowed with unalienable rights and that governments, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, existed to protect those rights when governments did not fulfill the wishes and needs of the governed. The latter had the right to remove them. In other words, people were starting to be seen as citizens with a say in their own states, rather than subjects of an unelected ruler. What was implied, however, was that citizens, usually assumed to be men, had a corresponding duty to come to the defense of their state. That was to be made explicit in the course of the French Revolution. A few years later, in 1792, as France's conservative enemies gathered against it, the new Legislative Assembly called on French men to defend their nation. The following year, the government decreed the levée en masse, a mass mobilization unlike anything seen in the previous century. And this time, women were included in the appeal as well. From this moment, until the enemy is driven from the territory of the Republic, all the French people are permanently requisitioned for the armies. The young men will go to the front. Married men will forge arms and carry supplies. Women will make tents and clothing. Children will divide old linen into bandages. Old men will be carried into the squares to rouse the courage of the soldiers, to teach hatred of kings and the unity of the Republic. The wars that started then and merged into the Napoleonic Wars were about defending the French nation and its revolution. But they became something much more. The French spread out across Europe with missionary fervor, seeing their sacred mission as toppling unjust and authoritarian regimes and freeing their fellow Europeans. Such goals not only justified war, at least to the French, but gave free license to how it should be waged, and that meant without limits. Since France's enemies were standing in the way of a better world, they should be attacked, said Robespierre, not as ordinary enemies, but as assassins and rebel brigands. The indiscriminate slaughter of men, women, and children in the Vendée when the Republic put down a royalist and Catholic rebellion in 1793 was an indication of what that could mean. Their fervor made the revolutionary armies cruel, but it also brought them victory after victory. And when a military genius, Napoleon, took charge, France proved for a time invincible. French soldiers may not have marched in perfect unison like their enemies, but they did not have to be forced into battle. Their skirmishers could be trusted to run toward the enemy lines ahead of the main attack. When French armies, time and time again, surprised the enemy by arriving much sooner than expected, it was because they could march at night. The old-style armies had to encamp with guards to keep their soldiers from deserting. The Comte Jacques Dugibert had written presciently in 1772, "But suppose that there should arise in Europe a people vigorous in its genius, its resources, and its government, a people in whom austere virtues and a national militia were joined to a settled policy of aggrandizement, one which did not lose sight of its purpose, which knew how to make war cheaply and to subsist on its victories, and was not reduced to laying down its arms through financial need." We would see such a people subjugate its neighbors and overthrow their feeble constitutions, as the north wind shakes the tender reeds. In the end, the French were to be defeated in part because they had aroused the very emotions in others that had carried them to power. The Spanish, the Prussians, and the Russians who experienced French invasions were not grateful to be offered their liberty on the point of a French sword. And so the French found themselves confronting awakening different nationalisms and wars of national resistance. In the century after the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, old and new nationalisms welded together peoples who had never been accustomed to thinking of themselves as members of a nation, sharing such characteristics as culture, language, history, religion, customs. And on the edge, where racial theories flourished, biology, education, and improved communications helped to spread the uses of a national language, where in the 18th century, the majority of people within France's borders spoke languages such as Breton or Languedoc or local dialects. By the end of the 19th, most spoke French national histories, and they were the ones taught in all European schools, created national stories and myths with moments of glory or of humiliation. Nationalisms dressed themselves, too, in the language and iconography of religion. The Polish or Serbian nations would rise again as Christ had after his crucifixion, and sacrifices in the present would bring kingdoms of heaven on earth in the future. And organized religion, the Polish Catholic hierarchy, or Serbian Orthodox Church, for example, supported the nation enthusiastically in return. In the First World War, all sides and all the religions involved, from Christianity to Islam, called on their gods to aid them. "Kill Germans," was the Bishop of London's message in 1914. To kill them not for the sake of killing, but to save the world. To kill the good as well as the bad. To kill the young men as well as the old. War was more often than not seen as an integral and necessary part of the emergence of the nation, as sanctifying it even. And the military wore a particular halo as its defenders and saviors. As a member of the Frankfurt Parliament said in 1848, a year marked by nationalist uprisings across Europe, mere existence does not entitle a nation to political independence, only the force to assert itself as a state. Among others, the German historian Heinrich von Treitschke, whose public lectures and writings were highly popular before the First World War, argued that war not only creates the state, but the nation too, by welding people together in a common cause, even if the people would rather not be welded like so many bits of scrap metal. Authoritarian governments have often used war as a way to unite their people against a common external enemy. They have also found it a handy excuse to crack down on dissent and those they see as dangerous revolutionaries. Conservatives, including Kaiser Wilhelm II himself, had longed before 1914 to dissolve the Reichstag, where, to their alarm, the Socialist Party was steadily gaining seats and get rid of the Constitution altogether. In 1914, as Germany went to war, the Chancellor had to intervene to prevent Wilhelm and his supporters banning the Socialists. It was a wise decision. Not only did the Socialist deputies, who made up the largest single party, vote for war credits, but Germany entered the war united, as the working classes rushed to support the war effort. For many nationalists, war was midwife to the nation and gave it vitality and life. Mussolini declared that war brings to its highest tension all human energy and puts the stamp of nobility upon the peoples who have the courage to meet it. Indeed, so it was argued, a people that was not prepared to fight for its existence probably did not deserve to survive. Is not war, asked an article in a leading British military journal before the First World War, the grand scheme of nature by which degenerate, weak, or otherwise harmful states are eliminated from the concerted action of civilized nations and assimilated to those who are strong, vital, and beneficial in their influences? So often in the 19th century, and it still happens today, defeat in war was described in the language of castration or emasculation. The assumption that the French revolutionaries made with their Levant en masse, that citizens had an obligation to the state and the nation, reached its ghastly apogee in 1945 in Germany, when the top Nazi leadership refused to take any measures that might have saved German lives. When the International Committee of the Red Cross suggested safe zones in Berlin where civilians could gather and be spared the coming battle, the Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces spurned the offer with contempt. It was only an attempt to test the will to resist of the German people. Agreement would be the first step toward becoming soft. Hundreds of thousands more Germans, military and civilians, died as a result. Hitler, in his bunker, went to his death raving that the German nation had failed him. The state no longer belonged to the citizen, but the opposite nationalism served to inspire wars, and it also, as in the Vendée, led to a demonization of the enemy, whether the military or civilians, who were seen as an existential threat to a just cause and as impediments standing in the way of the fulfillment of the nation. When General Sherman cut his swathe of destruction on his march to the sea in 1864, he said, "We are not fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war as well as their organized armies." In the Franco-Prussian War, any French civilians who took up weapons against the invasion were treated by the Germans as having no rights. More whole communities could be punished. As the Prussian chief of the General Staff, General von Moltke, often known as the Elder, to distinguish him from his less effective nephew, ordered, "The most effective way of dealing with the situation is to destroy the premises concerned, or where participation has been more general, the entire village." As French resistance continued in the winter of 1870 to 71, a German officer was horrified at the mutual hatreds between the French and the Germans and their effect on his own troops. Atrocious attacks are avenged by atrocities which remind one of the 30 Years' War. At von Moltke's headquarters, the American General Philip Sheridan, who had laid waste to the Shenandoah Valley in the Civil War, gave his advice that once the enemy army was finished off, it was necessary to inflict so much pain on the civilians that they would beg their government to make peace. The people must be left with nothing but their eyes to weep with over the war. Civilians were often even more vehement than the military. The wife of the great Prussian Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, who was otherwise a sedate German housewife, exclaimed that the French should be shot and stabbed to death, due down to the little babies. Years later, in one of his last public speeches, von Moltke was to warn about the new sorts of wars that he had helped to unleash. The age, he said, of cabinet wars, that is, wars determined by rulers for limited ends, was over. All we have now is people's war, and any prudent government will hesitate to bring about a war of this nature, which with all its incalculable consequences, the great powers, he went on, would find it difficult to bring such wars to an end or admit defeat. Gentlemen, it may be a war of 7 years or of 30 years' duration, and woe to him who sets Europe alight, who puts the first fuse to the powder keg. Nationalism provided the motivation. In the powder keg and the Industrial Revolution, the means populations were growing thanks to better living conditions, which meant that there were many more potential soldiers, and the new factories could turn out millions of what they needed, from boots to bayonets. Weapons production had formerly been limited because they were made by hand by skilled craftsmen. Now the introduction of standardized machine made interchangeable parts, and assembly lines made guns available on a mass scale, much as it did the cheap pianos which decorated the living rooms of the growing middle classes. Holger Herwig, a military historian, has calculated that it would have taken the artisans of one of the biggest Prussian arms manufacturers in the first half of the 19th century, 30 years, to make enough guns for the 320,000 men of the Prussian army at the time. But by 1860, one French arms manufacturer was able to produce 1 million guns in only 4 years. In 1860, in the quiet open spaces of Wimbledon Common, Queen Victoria pulled a cord to fire the new Whitworth rifle and inaugurate the National Rifle Association. She hit the bullseye on a target 400 yards away. Rifled barrels made guns, both small arms and artillery, more accurate. And improved metallurgy meant they could contain far more powerful explosives, capable of sending deadly balls and shells over much greater distances with greater force. As cartridges, bullets, and shells replaced the separate projectiles, powder and wadding, used for centuries, rifles and field artillery could be loaded quicker and fired more often by soldiers who needed much less training to do so. By the end of the 1860s, the French army was equipped with the chassepot, not some archaic hunting term, but the name of the inventor, which could be sighted up to 1,600 yards, and even when it was loaded with single bullets, could get off 6 shots per minute. Magazines preloaded with bullets increased the rate of fire still more. In the American Civil War, a reasonably efficient soldier with a rifle and magazines could fire 16 shots per minute. By the end of the 19th century, the machine gun, which could fire hundreds of bullets a minute, had made its appearance. As a French general reportedly said after the long drawn-out Battle of Verdun in the Great War, 3 men and a machine gun can stop a battalion of heroes. Today, the famous Kalashnikov rifle can fire 600 rounds a minute to a distance of well over half a mile. Another of the great changes in war in the 19th century was that where once armies had marched, they now had mechanized transport. They still had to march once they had disembarked at railheads from their trains. Or if lorries were not available before the Industrial Revolution, armies were like locusts. Once they had eaten everything in sight, they had to move on. The size of Napoleon's armies, like those of Alexander or Frederick the Great, had been limited by the supplies from food to ammunition that they could carry or forage. Napoleon lost most of his great army in Russia when his soldiers starved or froze to death. Now, with trains or steamships, armies could be moved great distances more quickly and kept in the field much longer as fresh supplies kept coming in. The changes to war were equally great at sea. Although the British Navy kept sails on its first steam-powered ships just in case, steam and the new turbines made ships more reliable, maneuverable, and fast. Coal and coaling stations around the world, and later oil, now became important strategic assets and targets. The new technology made it possible for the ships to carry armor, which was initially installed over the wood and much heavier guns. The invention of the gun turret, which could swivel 360 degrees, meant that ships no longer had to fire broadsides, which left their whole length exposed to counterfire, but could fire over their bows and sterns as well. Although some naval officers were convinced that ships made entirely of metal would sink, by the end of the 19th century, all the world's navies were building steel ships. In 1906, before a crowd of 50,000 gathered at Portsmouth Dockyard, Edward VII of Britain launched HMS Dreadnought, the largest warship ever seen on the seas. The great mass of metal, said the Daily Mail's correspondent, glided into the sea so smoothly, noiselessly, and at such an even speed that it made one think of some graceful bird descending into its natural element. The Dreadnought was heavier and faster than anything in any other navy, including the German, which was very much the point of it. Such was the integration of Europe's economy, however, that it was made of the best steel the German firm of Krupps could provide. It carried 5,000 tons of armor and 10 12-inch guns. The measurement refers to the muzzle, which meant that they were firing very big shells indeed, as well as batteries of smaller guns. It immediately rendered the battleships of other navies obsolete, and so, reluctantly, the other powers were obliged to follow suit and build their own versions. The growing range of the naval guns, from around 10 miles in the First World War up to 18 miles by the Second World War, meant that navies could engage without ever seeing each other. Inevitably, navies scrambled to find countermeasures as well, from fast destroyers and torpedo boats designed to hunt out the heavier, slower vessels to mines. War at sea, as on land, also moved into new dimensions with submarines. Naval war was increasingly fought under the oceans and directed as much against shipping as enemy ships. By the end of the First World War, theorists were embracing the aircraft as a way to both find and sink enemy ships, and the first aircraft carriers were built in the 1920s. The changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution did not happen overnight, and there were many disasters along the way as the military and their societies learned to use and organize the new resources at their disposal. In 1859, Napoleon III, the nephew of the great man, sent a large force by train to Italy to fight Austria. The men arrived, but without blankets, food, or ammunition. It was, he admitted, the opposite of what we should have done. Russia experienced the same difficulties in its war with Japan in 1904 to 05, when poor planning left the Trans-Siberian Railway in chaos, with crucial supplies left to go to waste on railway sidings. In the summer of 1914, however, Germany was able to move 2 million men, 1,189,000 horses, and all their equipment on 20,000 trains into Belgium and northern France on the Western Front, with very few hitches. In the first 2 weeks of August, German trains, each of 54 cars, were moving toward the French frontier, across the Rhine, on the crucial Hohenzollern Bridge at Cologne, every 10 minutes. The Prussian government, and then the German one after 1871, followed the wishes of the military in building its railway network so that troops and supplies could be moved quickly to the frontiers. The Germans were also among the first to realize that the new railways could only be useful if they were organized properly. Germany pioneered the General Staff, the necessary brain to move the behemoth of the new mass armies about. A 19th century joke had it that there were 5 perfect things in Europe: the Curia of the Catholic Church, the British Parliament, the Russian Ballet, the French Opera, and the German General Staff. Manned with bright and ambitious officers, it had grown from a small experiment as Prussia scrambled to deal with Napoleon to a professional and cohesive body, 800 strong by 1905. The key railway section had a staff of 80. General Gruner, its chief in 1914, was so devoted to railway lines and junctions that he had spent his honeymoon plotting railway timetables with his new wife. The General Staff's function was to gather intelligence about the enemy and, above all, to make plans to achieve victory. Staff officers studied everything from forts to understand their strengths and weaknesses to American circuses, to learn ways of moving quantities of people, animals, and equipment across great distances. The plans that emerged were tested, modified, and tested again year after year. Modern war obliged societies as a whole to become more organized and mobilize their resources better or risk defeat. Perhaps the key factor that brought down the Tsarist regime in 1917 was its inability to supply the troops at the front and feed the cities at home. Samuel Pepys in the 17th century was a harbinger of the growing bureaucracies of the modern age. Even in peacetime, governments steadily extended their control over society with preparations for war in mind. Growing bureaucracies amassed statistics and kept better records because governments needed to know how to find the money, the resources, and the men they needed. And they also needed the means to extract them. Censuses, and most states were adopting them in the 19th century, provide all sorts of useful demographic information, not least the number of men of military age. We take citizenship and citizenship papers for granted today, but in the 19th century, governments often had little idea of how many citizens they had, and who therefore had an obligation to fight for the country. As a result, new laws and regulations defined who counted and who did not. After 1842, Prussian men of military age could not emigrate without permission. In French villages, where conscription was regarded as unfairly removing valuable labor, the names of young men often did not make it onto the official returns, so an official had to come to count heads if conscripts failed to report. As also happened, someone had to find the missing men, and much of the drive to improve public health, diet, living conditions, and education came from the need for fit and healthy recruits. When I was a student in Britain in the 1960s, I never understood why all pubs closed for the afternoon. The authorities had introduced those hours in 1915 to ensure that factory workers did not drink too much or miss an afternoon's work. And the British lived with the effects until the late 1980s, when the licensing laws were finally amended. Modern war, when it came, speeded up and extended the degree of government control over society. For factories were requisitioned, raw materials directed to where they were most needed, and skilled labor in crucial industries such as mining could not move jobs or enlist without permission. Scientists have long been important in war. Think of the work of Archimedes or Leonardo da Vinci. But increasingly, governments have harnessed science to war by setting up special research centers, subsidizing industry, or offering research grants to universities. One of Hitler's many mistakes was to underestimate the value of science, a field in which Germany had once led the world. The Nazi regime neglected basic research and allowed some of its best scientists to join up, so that they wasted their expertise and often ended their lives on the battlefields. The Nazis also drove out Jewish scientists, among them Albert Einstein, with the result that the exiles were able to offer their talents to Germany's opponents. Without the work of the refugee scientists, it is unlikely that the Allies could have developed the atomic bomb so quickly. Or, as a chilling alternative possibility, Hitler might have had it in his hands. Except for his own racial policies, the Manhattan Project to develop the bomb was the single greatest example of science being directed to military ends. But the war stimulated research into a vast range of new weapons and technologies. The British and the Americans in particular brought together hundreds of scientists in projects that ranged from the development of radar to rockets. For the first time, what came to be known as operational research was used to calculate the efficacy, costs, and benefits of particular devices or strategies. At first glance, the invention of a device by the British Ministry of Food to spray dry eggs seems trivial beside powerful new weapons. And the daring exploits of a British engineer in the First World War who blew up Romanian oil wells and so denied their output to the Central Powers make an interesting footnote to the history of the war. Yet both point to another important part of modern war, the provision of resources for sustenance of the population, or the war effort of one's own side, and the denial of them through sabotage, direct attack, or blockade. The first essential condition for an army to be able to stand the strain of battle, said the German general Erwin Rommel, is an adequate stock of weapons, petrol, and ammunition. In fact, the battle is fought and decided by quartermasters before the shooting begins. Napoleon tried to stop trade between the British Isles and the continent to force the British to end hostilities. The British responded with their favored strategy of a naval blockade. They tried it again against Germany in the First World War. The German economy became increasingly unable to sustain the war effort without vital products such as foods or natural phosphates, crucial in making fertilizer. Germany responded as it did again in the Second World War, with unrestricted submarine warfare directed against British and neutral shipping using British ports. Although Germany made up some of the shortfall in what it needed by plundering occupied Belgium, and then, in 1918, by its peace with Russia, which gave it access to the wheat and minerals of Ukraine, it could never match the Allied powers for resources. Before the Pacific War broke out in 1941, the Americans embargoed exports of metal and oil to Japan, which relied largely on such imports. Although the Japanese opted for war and for a time swept all resistance before them, in the long run they too ran out of resources as American bombers, destroyers, and submarines sank Japanese shipping at a much faster rate than it could be replaced. Food has always been a critical front in the struggle over resources. Besieging armies have counted on the help of hunger to force garrisons to surrender. Armies, as Napoleon said, march on their stomachs, and denying them food has long been a tactic in war. Just as the Roman general Fabius Maximus weakened Hannibal's armies by disrupting their supply lines, the Russians have countered invaders from Napoleon to Hitler by scorched earth policies where they have destroyed their own crops and livestock. As war became more encompassing, feeding the home front became crucial to maintaining the war effort. By the end of the First World War, many Germans, especially the poorer classes in the cities, were starving, and desperate housewives marched banging their empty pots and pans. This was later characterized by the German High Command as part of the stab in the back, which had made it impossible for German troops to fight on. The food shortages were partly caused by the British blockade, but were also the result of the German government's inefficient planning and ineffective rationing. In both World Wars, Britain managed with much greater success to increase its food production and ensure a fairer distribution. During the Second World War, the British doubled their arable land by plowing up pastures and parks. By focusing on crops such as wheat and potatoes at the expense of animal husbandry, they increased the proportion of homegrown food in the British diet. Stringent government controls meant that scarce shipping was used for high-calorie foods such as meat and cheese, rather than sugar, nuts, or fresh fruit. When my father, who was in the Canadian Navy, docked in Britain for the first time and prepared to meet his new British in-laws, he brought with him as a present a giant stock of bananas which he had picked up as his ship came through the Panama Canal. His fellow train passengers looked at the sight with awe and asked only to be able to sniff the fruit. Yet if most British never saw a banana or an orange from one end of the war to the other, could have only minuscule amounts of sugar or butter, and ate some strange dishes, their diets were enough to keep them fed and healthy. War, particularly large-scale, prolonged war, makes many demands, and it is hideously, often ruinously expensive. Indeed, when the First World War broke out, most of the world, including the European belligerents themselves, assumed that it would have to end after a short time as money and resources ran out. Instead, states rapidly learned how to manage and expropriate society's wealth on a much greater scale than they had imagined possible. Walter Scheitel has estimated that in the First World War, the state in belligerent powers such as France, Germany, or Great Britain increased its share of GDP from 4 to 8 times. By the middle of the Second World War, Germany was using the equivalent of 73% of its GNP for the war effort. When peace came, governments did not relinquish all the levers of power they had amassed or unlearn the lessons about extracting resources from society. Taxes certainly did not go back to pre-war levels. Indeed, in the case of Russia after 1917, as it became the Soviet Union, Lenin and his successor Stalin organized and ran a command economy, allocating resources and directing labor as if they were at war, because industry, technology, and better organization of society made the mobilization of their resources possible. Even in peacetime, European countries found themselves obliged to create bigger armed forces or be left behind their neighbors. By the end of the 19th century, all the great powers, with the exception of Britain, which relied on the seas and its navy, the most powerful in the world, to protect it, had adopted peacetime conscription, which obliged young men of military age to do military service for a stated period and then remain in the reserves for another number of years. This meant that nations had large armies in existence, and much larger ones that could be summoned up in a crisis. Nevertheless, conservatives saw conscription as potentially dangerous. Training men from the lower classes might be putting weapons into the hands of revolutionaries, and men from the cities, it was widely assumed, must be feebler and less able to endure hardships and discipline than sturdy peasants from the countryside. Another problem was that bigger armies needed more officers, which meant that the pool of recruits had to be expanded beyond the landed gentry and aristocracy, who had dominated the officer class for centuries. Middle-class men used to comfortable bourgeois lives, perhaps with artistic or intellectual tastes, and certainly not toughened by country sports, could not be expected so old-style officers, said to share their values or their willingness to serve their king and country and die in their service. In fact, many such fears turned out to be groundless, where the French authorities had expected that some 20% of their reserves would not come when called back to service in 1914. Less than 1% failed to report for duty. Middle-class men, far from infecting the officer corps with their values, rather took on aristocratic ones. And military service tended to make ordinary soldiers more patriotic. If anything, a German general, speaking before the First World War, urged his soldiers to ensure that they made their men into loyal subjects. Socialist ideas, he said, were a sickness which a good dose of military training would cure. He might not have been amused if he'd known that the revolutionary Leon Trotsky, later the creator of the Bolsheviks' Red Army, agreed on the value of military training. The army, he said, is that school where the party can instill moral hardness, self-sacrifice, and discipline. Change is never easy for hierarchical organizations, and the military, through time, has treated innovations such as conscription with suspicion. The British Army clung to the practice of allowing young men to buy commands long after most continental armies had abandoned it as inefficient. It was a convenient way for the government to raise funds and for the army to ensure that it got the right sort of men. The Royal Navy, understandably, had never seen the point of putting rich, untrained ninnies in charge of expensive ships. The practice was finally abolished in 1871, when disasters caused by incompetent officers, most notably the futile and bloody charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War, had caused too much public furor to be ignored. New weapons were often greeted with equal suspicion, just as knights in armor had tried to ignore the fact that the crossbow, the longbow, and the gun had made them obsolete. Many in the officer classes in the 19th century initially downplayed new weapons and tactics and refused to contemplate countermeasures. Field Marshal Sir Garnet Wolseley, a formidable Anglo-Irishman who served in conflicts all over the empire and was commander-in-chief of British forces from 1895 to 1901, opposed trenches on the grounds that they would make troops less willing to climb out and attack. In 1903, a young colonel, Ferdinand Foch, then an instructor at France's War College, presented neat mathematical proofs that two attacking battalions against one on the defensive could fire twice as many bullets. And so all that was needed for victory was twice as many attackers as defenders. As Supreme Allied Commander in the First World War, he was to dismiss airplanes, tout ça c'est du sport before that war, and sometimes long after, many in the military continued to seek cavalry as a major component in fighting. "It must be accepted as a principle," said the 1907 British Cavalry Manual, "that the rifle, effective as it is, cannot replace the effect produced by the speed of the horse, the magnetism of the charge, and the terror of cold steel." Britain's Inspector General of Cavalry in the 1890s argued that smokeless gunpowder, contrary to what pessimists believed, gave an advantage to charging cavalry. True, the new gunpowder helped to conceal the enemy soldiers, whose weapons no longer gave away a telltale puff of smoke. But since the battlefields were now free from the fogs that had once covered them, the sight of the men on horseback bearing down was bound to demoralize the defenders. Cavalry officers, who came overwhelmingly from the land-owning upper classes, also despised those they saw as mere technicians. In Austria's armies, the cavalry dismissed officers in the artillery as the powder Jews, and even among artillery officers themselves. Riding was considered to be more important than technical expertise. Many men and many horses were to die before the cavalry abandoned their horses for the despised new tanks and armored vehicles. It did not help that anti-intellectualism was a matter of pride in many military circles. The British Army Staff College was established in the mid-19th century over the objections of the senior military, and in its early years only educated a handful of officers a year. When an officer in a fashionable British regiment thought of applying to it, one of his fellow officers said, "Well, I will give one piece of advice, and that is to say nothing about it to your brother officers, or you will get yourself jolly well disliked." Horace Smith Dorrien, who became one of the more effective British generals in the First World War, remembered his time at the Staff College as rather pleasant. "I enjoyed every minute of my 2 years there. I do not think we were taught as much as we might have been, but there was plenty of sport and not too much work." He never managed to find the library, but was still able to pass his final examination. For all their bluster, however, Europe's military were uneasily aware that warfare and the world around them were changing. They could see the new power of the defense for themselves because they sent observers to major conflicts both in Europe and around the world. If they resisted new technology, they were more open to ideas from the developing science of psychology, in part as a solution to the challenges posed by the hardware, and in part because they were getting new sorts of recruits with a degree of education who had to be handled differently from illiterate peasants. The question of how to motivate soldiers goes back as far as war itself, of course, but its study has become more systematic in the past 2 centuries. The military have brought in psychologists to help them find the best recruits, to test them in training and in battle, and to try to understand how humans behave under pressure. Unfortunately, before the First World War, psychology and motivation were seen too often as the antidote to increased firepower on the battlefield. As Colonel Louis Dugras-Maison, one of the leading French military theorists of the period, said in his classic work on infantry training, "We are rightly told that psychological factors are paramount in combat." But this is not all. Properly speaking, there are no other factors. For all others, weaponry, maneuverability, influence only indirectly by provoking moral reactions. The human heart is the starting point in all questions of war. Soldiers were trained how to use bayonets in combat on the grounds that it would make them properly determined in the face of the enemy against machine guns and poison gas. On the killing fields of the First World War, determination and courage on their own were never enough. Much as they might have preferred to remain a caste apart, the modern military were also forced to take account of the broader social and political changes in their societies. War or preparations for it have made ever greater demands and forced changes on societies. But this has never been a one-way process. People are not inert lumps waiting for some powerful hand to shape them. They have ideas and values, and these have also shaped the development of the military and its relationship to society in the 19th and 20th centuries. As we have seen, nationalism fueled wars and obligated citizens to come to the aid of their country. But at the same time, citizens started to take a greater interest in the policies and decisions of their governments and assert a right to shape or change these, the steady expansion of the franchise first for men. Germany had universal male suffrage from the time it became a country in 1871, and after the First World War, for most women, encouraged voters to take notice of what their governments were up to. Free public education, growing literacy, and the emergence of cheap newspapers with huge circulations meant that the public had much greater access to news, even far beyond the country's borders. And the advent of the telegraph, which by 1914 had bound the world together much as the internet does today, meant that the home audiences were following events such as wars and international crises, virtually as they were happening in the Crimean War of 1853 to 56. A new type of journalist, the war correspondent, appeared. William Howard Russell's dispatches for the Times in particular simultaneously enthralled and horrified the British public. For the first time, the British realized just how incompetent their own military could be and how badly their soldiers were treated. The subsequent public outcry brought much-needed changes to the Army and paved the way for the work of Florence Nightingale and her colleagues in improving military hospitals and the general health of the soldiers. Newspapers and publishers realized that war was good for sales. In the Franco-Prussian War, for example, the circulation of London's daily news tripled. At the turn of the century, an ambitious 24-year-old Winston Churchill found fame and earned a fortune reporting on the South African War. War correspondents and photographers, Ernest Hemingway, Edward R. Keir Murrow, Robert Capa, Michael Heyer, Marie Colvin have become modern heroes. Seeing the horrors of war can have significant impact at home. And television, film, and now social media have vastly expanded our opportunities to do so. The American government lost the battle for public opinion during the Vietnam War because the network's evening news and print reporting persuaded large sections of the public that the war was both unjust and disgraceful. After the war ended, Colonel Harry Summers, a leading American military thinker, visited Hanoi. In a conversation with a North Vietnamese colonel, he remarked, "You know you never defeated us on the battlefield." After a moment, the North Vietnamese replied, "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant. Democracies, where leaders are always conscious of the next election, have a particularly hard time sustaining unpopular wars, as the French had discovered in their own war in Indochina. But even the authoritarian Soviet Union paid a high political cost for its unsuccessful and unpopular war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Public opinion can also work the other way, pushing governments into stances and wars they do not want. Navy and Army leagues, veterans associations, and defense industries have shown great skills in whipping up public demands for more spending on the military. In a farewell speech in 1961, President Eisenhower, who as a general knew what he was talking about, warned in the councils of government, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." In the 1890s, Britain and Germany found themselves in a confrontation over the Samoan Islands in the South Pacific because of public opinion, even though diplomats and political leaders were willing to broker a deal. For even though the great majority of our pothouse politicians did not know whether Samoa was a fish or a fowl or a foreign queen, a German diplomat complained, "They shouted all the more loudly that whatever else it was German and must remain forever." German General Charles Gordon was sent by the British government to Khartoum in 1884 to rescue Egyptian forces trapped there by a revolt against Egyptian misrule by the local Sudanese, led by the Mahdi. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, had been reluctant to intervene at all, but his government was pressured by public opinion, which had embraced the strange, half-mad Gordon as a hero. Although Gordon had strict instructions to leave as soon as he had fulfilled his mission, he disobeyed them and chose to stay. In a vain attempt to put down the Sudanese, the result was that he and his tiny force were besieged in Khartoum. Gordon, with his ostentatious piety, his apparent simplicity, his conviction that he had been sent by God to save the Sudan, whether from misrule or Islam or both, skillfully swayed public opinion in his favor. From Khartoum, thanks to the dispatches he sent by telegraph, at least until the Mahdi's forces cut the lines. Gladstone, who was furious with Gordon, procrastinated over sending an expensive relief force. But when vicars across the country offered prayers for Gordon, when the press talked about Britain's shame and asked Gordon or Gladstone, and when even Queen Victoria weighed in, "General Gordon is in danger. You are bound to try to save him," she told the Secretary of State for War. Gladstone was forced to give way. He sent an expedition which arrived 2 days after Gordon had died. In 1896, a conservative government sent an expedition to avenge Gordon. Thousands of Sudanese died in the ensuing conflict, and Britain ended up with responsibility for the Sudan. Governments and their military have learned to play the game of manipulating public opinion too. In the First and Second World Wars, all sides controlled war correspondence carefully, lest too realistic a picture of the fighting weaken public morale. Although the U.S. military allowed reporters extraordinary access in Vietnam, it drew the conclusion that it must never make that mistake again. In both wars with Iraq, the media were tightly controlled and managed. The Americans may have learned from the British in the 1982 Falklands War, when the Ministry of Defense went to great lengths to prevent publication of news from the South Atlantic. Even the most anodyne naval reviews, troop march pasts, military bands playing, and fighter planes and dazzling aerobatics have all entertained the public over the years and, so it is hoped, made them proud of their armed forces and willing to provide the funds for them. If most democracies show off their military less today, countries such as Russia, China, or Iran still show off their military force and encourage public support. When Admiral Tirpitz set out to build Germany's Great Fleet before 1914, one of the first steps he took was to establish a special office for news and parliamentary affairs. Over the next decades, it lobbied members of the Reichstag, organized dozens of public lectures, distributed thousands of pamphlets, and made sure that each new battleship was launched with great public fanfare. When the British responded to the German naval challenge by building its dreadnoughts, the Royal Navy played its own role in getting public support for the necessary funding. In 1909, during a crisis over increased naval and social spending, it brought ships up the Thames to London for a week-long show with fireworks, mock fights, and special children's programs, which drew 4 million people. Today, the absurd spectacle of the high-stepping soldiers from India and Pakistan, who nightly strut their robotic low and folding of flags with their high kicks, stamps, and twirls at a border crossing on the old trunk road between their two countries, draws increasingly large cheering crowds from each side and is a YouTube favorite. It is surely a bit of harmless fun. Or is it? Both countries have nuclear weapons and a long history of conflict and mutual suspicion and militarism. Whether that means elevating the military to a position as the noblest and best of their societies, or the leaching of military values, such as discipline and obedience, into the civilian world can lead to trouble for democratic societies in Pakistan in particular, The military are seen as the bulwark and protector of the nation, and are largely free from civilian control and scrutiny. The infamous Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate has backed and funded terrorist groups in India, the disputed territory of Kashmir, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, not for the good of those countries or of Pakistan itself. It is widely accepted that some of Pakistan's generals have sold nuclear technology to North Korea. Civilian leaders who have tried to rein in the military have rapidly found themselves out of office and, if they are lucky, in exile. In both India and Pakistan, civilian politics have taken on a military tinge, with some political parties sponsoring paramilitary organizations whose members wear uniforms, march in formation with flags, and carry sticks to menace their opponents. Or, in the case of India's Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, it looks more as though the paramilitary Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh sponsors it. The First World War had a deep impact on European society, not least in the persistence of wartime values and organizations. Long after the war itself had ended, former soldiers formed paramilitary groups, and in some cases, such as the German Freikorps in the Baltics or the Black and Tans in Ireland, carried on fighting in the small wars that plagued Europe. Until the mid-1920s, right-wing politics in Germany were imbued with nostalgia for the spirit of 1914, when, so it was believed, the German nation had sunk all its differences in a common cause. Veterans turned out in their uniforms to march, and the new fascist and communist movements had their own uniforms and formations, obeyed their leaders unquestioningly, and went out on expeditions to beat up their enemies. For us, an Italian fascist said, "The war has never come to an end. We simply replaced external enemies with internal ones." Wars can leave the marks of militarism in both senses of the word on society, but militarism can also lead to war. 19th century Europe provides a warning of what can happen during a long peace when the military come in to see themselves as superior to society, the best and bravest part of it, with a special, even divine mission to protect the nation. And when military values trump civilian ones, in Germany, Wilhelm Vogt, an enterprising petty crook, inadvertently exposed the impact of militarism on German society and held it up to ridicule. Dressed in odds and ends of uniform, he assumed command of a group of soldiers in Berlin and took them off to the nearby town of Köpenick, where he had a wonderful time arresting city officials and taking possession of a large sum of money. Although he was eventually found out and sent to jail, the captain of Köpenick became a folk hero among the many Germans who were anti-militaristic and among Germany's enemies, and made a tidy living lecturing about his experiences. Yet his story underscores the particular place the German military occupied. It answered only to the Kaiser and both its officers, and he resented any questioning from the Reichstag. Although the Army's Schlieffen Plan committed Germany to a two-front war against France and Russia and the invasion of Belgium, whose neutrality Germany had undertaken to respect, the Chancellor Theobald von Bietenmann-Hollweg did not learn about it until 1912, and then his only reaction was that if the military deemed the strategy necessary, he would do what he could to help diplomatically. His reverence for the military was such that when he had gone to the Reichstag for the